pouco não caiu em cima da gente.
Since 1900, Mother Nature has unleashed catastrophes that dwarf anything Hollywood could imagine. Earthquakes that killed more people than World War I. Floods that covered areas larger than entire countries. Storms that wiped nations off the map and changed the course of history. Today, we're counting down the 15 deadliest natural disasters since 1900, based on verified death tolls and documented destruction. These aren't just statistics. They're the moments when nature reminded humanity exactly who's in charge. 15, October 8, 2005, Kashmir earthquake, 87,000 deaths. A 7.6 magnitude earthquake struck the disputed Kashmir region at 8:50 a.m., when schools were full and offices were bustling with morning activity. The quake devastated Pakistan's northwest frontier province and parts of India and Afghanistan. What made this earthquake particularly deadly was the mountainous terrain and poor construction standards. Buildings collapsed like dominoes, trapping entire families. The earthquake triggered massive landslides that buried villages and blocked rescue routes for days. Over 32,000 buildings collapsed completely. In some areas, 90% of structures were destroyed. The timing was catastrophic. Children were in school, workers were in offices, and the approaching winter meant survivors faced freezing temperatures with no shelter. International rescue teams struggled to reach remote mountain villages. Helicopters became the only way to deliver aid, but bad weather often grounded flights. Many survivors waited over a week for help, and some remote communities weren't reached for nearly a month. 14, May 2nd, 2008. Cyclone Nargis, 138,000 deaths. Cyclone Nargis slammed into Myanmar's Irrawaddy Delta with 165-mile-per-hour winds and a 12-foot storm surge. The Category 4 cyclone struck one of the world's most densely populated river deltas, where millions live just feet above sea level. The storm surge penetrated 25 miles inland, completely submerging entire townships. Villages built on stilts offered no protection against the wall of water. Survivors described floating bodies and debris as far as the eye could see. Myanmar's military government initially refused international aid, claiming they could handle the disaster alone. This delayed relief efforts for crucial weeks, while survivors struggled without food, clean water, or medical care. The government's response became an international scandal. The cyclone destroyed 95% of buildings in the hardest-hit areas. Rice paddies were contaminated with salt water, creating food shortages that lasted for years. The disaster highlighted Myanmar's isolation and the military government's indifference to civilian suffering. 13. April 29, 1991. Bangladesh cyclone, 140,000 deaths. A Category 5 cyclone with 160-mile-per-hour winds struck Bangladesh's Chittagong coast, generating a 20-foot storm surge that swept across the flat coastal plains. The cyclone hit during high tide, maximizing the surge's destructive power. Bangladesh had learned from the devastating 1970 Bola cyclone and built concrete storm shelters throughout the coastal region. However, many people ignored evacuation warnings or couldn't reach shelters in time. Cultural factors also played a role. Some women refused to enter shelters with unrelated men. The storm surge traveled up to 12 miles inland, destroying everything in its path. Entire islands disappeared beneath the waves. Survivors clung to trees for days, watching bodies and debris float past in the churning waters. Over 10 million people lost their homes. The cyclone destroyed 1 million houses and damaged another 1.2 million. Crops were ruined by salt water, leading to food shortages that persisted for months. Despite the tragedy, the death toll was lower than the 1970 cyclone, proving that early warning systems and shelters could save lives. 12. January 12, 2010. Haiti earthquake. 200,000 to 316,000 deaths. At 4:53 p.m., a 7.0 magnitude earthquake struck just 15 miles from Port-au-Prince, Haiti's capital. The shallow quake lasted only 35 seconds, but it was enough to reduce much of the city to rubble. Haiti's extreme poverty made the disaster uniquely catastrophic. Buildings were constructed with substandard materials and no earthquake codes. Concrete structures built with beach sand instead of proper aggregate crumbled instantly. Rebar was often omitted to save money. The presidential palace collapsed into a pile of white rubble. The UN headquarters crumbled, killing 102 international staff. The main cathedral's roof caved in during evening prayers. Even hospitals that should have treated the injured were destroyed, forcing doctors to operate in parking lots. Over 1.5 million people were left homeless in a country already struggling with extreme poverty. Tent cities sprang up in every available space, housing families for years. The international response was massive but chaotic, with hundreds of aid organizations working without coordination. 11. December 26, 2004, Indian Ocean tsunami, 230,000 deaths. At 7:58 a.m. local time, a 9.1 magnitude earthquake off Sumatra's coast triggered the deadliest tsunami in recorded history. The massive displacement of the ocean floor generated waves that radiated across the Indian Ocean at jet speeds. In Banda Aceh, Indonesia, waves reached 100 feet high and penetrated 4 miles inland. The city of 300,000 was reduced to a wasteland of debris and bodies. Entire neighborhoods were swept away, leaving only concrete foundations. The tsunami struck 14 countries around the Indian Ocean. In Thailand, tourists on Phuket's beaches watched in confusion as the ocean receded, exposing coral reefs. Minutes later, a black wall of water crashed ashore, carrying cars, buildings, and people back into the sea. What made this tsunami particularly tragic was the lack of warning systems in the Indian Ocean. While the Pacific had tsunami warning networks, the Indian Ocean had none. People had no idea what was coming until they saw the waves approaching. The disaster prompted the creation of the Indian Ocean Tsunami Warning System and revolutionized global disaster preparedness. It also marked the beginning of the smartphone era's impact on disaster documentation. Thousands of tourists captured the tsunami on video, creating an unprecedented visual record of a natural disaster. 10. November 12, 1970. Bola cyclone. 300,000 to 500,000 deaths. The deadliest tropical cyclone in recorded history struck East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, with 115-mile-per-hour winds and a 20-foot storm surge. The cyclone hit the densely populated Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta during high tide at night, the worst possible combination. The storm surge swept across islands barely above sea level, where millions of people lived in simple homes that offered no protection. Entire islands were submerged, and survivors described floating bodies as far as the eye could see. Weather forecasting was primitive in 1970, and many residents had never experienced a cyclone of this magnitude. Fishing boats caught at sea simply vanished. Coastal villages were erased so completely that survivors couldn't locate where their homes had stood. The disaster had profound political consequences. West Pakistan's inadequate response to the cyclone fueled independence movements in East Pakistan. The government's failure to provide adequate relief became a rallying cry for Bengali nationalism, contributing to the creation of Bangladesh in 1971. 9. July 28, 1976, Tangshan earthquake. 242,000 to 655,000 deaths. At 3:42 a.m., a 7.5 magnitude earthquake struck directly beneath Tangshan, an industrial city of 1 million people in northeastern China. In 23 seconds, 85% of the city's buildings collapsed, creating one of the deadliest earthquakes in recorded history. The earthquake's timing was catastrophic, striking before dawn when most people were asleep in bed. The city's industrial nature meant many lived in poorly constructed worker housing that pancaked instantly. Coal mines flooded immediately, trapping thousands of workers underground. What made Tangshan uniquely devastating was China's isolation during the Cultural Revolution. The government refused international aid and initially tried to hide the disaster's scope. Rescue efforts relied entirely on Chinese resources, which were inadequate for a catastrophe of this magnitude. A major 7.1 aftershock struck 15 hours later, collapsing buildings that had been damaged but still standing. Survivors who had been trapped in rubble were killed by the second collapse. The aftershock also hampered rescue efforts and caused additional casualties among rescue workers. 8. September 1st, 1923, Great Kanto earthquake. 105,000 to 140,000 deaths. 11:58 a.m. A 7.9 magnitude earthquake struck Japan's Kanto region just before lunchtime, when millions of households were cooking over open flames. The earthquake devastated Tokyo and Yokohama, but it was the fires that followed that caused most deaths. When buildings collapsed, cooking fires spread instantly through the wooden structures that dominated Japanese cities. Within hours, massive firestorms were raging across both cities. The fires created their own weather systems, generating tornado-like winds that spread flames even faster. In Tokyo's Sumida district, 40,000 people sought refuge in an open area that seemed safe from fires. But the firestorm created a tornado that swept flames across the refuge area, killing nearly everyone in minutes. The area became known as the site of the Clothes Depot tragedy. 7. December 28, 1908. Messina earthquake and tsunami. 123,000 deaths. 5:20 a.m. A 7.1 magnitude earthquake struck the Strait of Messina between Sicily and mainland Italy, followed immediately by a tsunami. The twin disasters destroyed the cities of Messina and Reggio Calabria almost completely. The earthquake struck before dawn when most people were asleep. Buildings constructed of unreinforced masonry collapsed instantly, trapping thousands. But within minutes, a 40-foot tsunami struck both sides of the strait, destroying everything the earthquake had left standing. In Messina, the tsunami penetrated over half a mile inland. Survivors who had escaped collapsed buildings were swept away by the waves. The city's port was completely destroyed, hampering rescue efforts for days. The disaster shocked Europe and prompted the first major international relief effort of the modern era. The Russian Baltic Fleet, returning from the Far East, diverted to help with rescue operations. The tragedy inspired new building codes throughout Italy and advanced the science of seismology. 6. May 31st, 1970, Ancash earthquake and avalanche. 70,000 deaths. 3:23 p.m. A 7.9 magnitude earthquake struck off Peru's coast, but the worst damage came from what it triggered: a massive avalanche that buried the town of Yungay in just 4 minutes. The earthquake loosened a huge chunk of ice and rock from Huascaran, Peru's highest peak. The debris avalanche, traveling at 200 miles per hour, completely buried Yungay and its 25,000 residents. Only 92 people survived, those who happened to be in the cemetery on higher ground. The avalanche was so fast that people had no time to escape. Survivors described a sound like thunder growing louder, then a wall of mud, ice, and boulders that erased their town completely. Where Yungay once stood, there was only a field of gray debris. The disaster prompted major changes in Peru's building codes and emergency preparedness. The site of Yungay was declared a national cemetery, and a new town was built on safer ground. The earthquake led to advances in avalanche prediction and mountain safety worldwide. 5. December 16, 1920. Haiyuan earthquake. 200,000 to 273,400 deaths. An 8.5 magnitude earthquake struck China's Ningxia province, triggering massive landslides that buried entire villages. The quake was felt across 7 provinces and created new lakes where none had existed before. The earthquake struck during winter when many people were indoors around heating fires. Collapsed buildings often caught fire immediately, trapping survivors in burning rubble. The region's low soil liquefied across vast areas, creating flowing rivers of earth. Entire mountains collapsed, damming rivers and creating temporary lakes that later burst and caused devastating floods downstream. The city of Haiyuan was completely destroyed. Not a single building remained standing. Communication with the outside world was cut for weeks. When relief finally arrived, rescuers found landscapes so altered by landslides that maps were useless. Some villages had been buried under 100 feet of debris. 4. August 8, 1975. Typhoon Nina and Banqiao Dam failure. 171,000 to 220,000 deaths. Typhoon Nina struck China's Henan province with unprecedented rainfall, over 1,000 millimeters in 24 hours. The deluge overwhelmed the Banqiao Dam, which had been designed to withstand a 1,000-year flood. Nina brought a 2,000-year flood. When the Banqiao Dam failed at 1 a.m., it released 492 million cubic meters of water in a devastating flood wave. The wall of water, reaching heights of 10 meters and traveling at 50 kilometers per hour, swept away everything in its path. The dam failure triggered a cascade of 61 more dam failures downstream. Villages were obliterated in minutes. The flood wave was so powerful, it carved new channels in the landscape and moved entire buildings intact for miles. What made this disaster particularly tragic was the secrecy surrounding it. China's government classified the disaster as a state secret for decades. International aid was refused, and the true death toll wasn't revealed until the 1990s. 3. February 4th, 1976. Guatemala earthquake. 23,000 deaths. 3 a.m. A 7.5 magnitude earthquake struck Guatemala along the Motagua Fault, creating a surface rupture 160 miles long. The quake devastated Guatemala City and surrounding areas, leaving over 1 million people homeless. The earthquake struck during early morning hours when most people were asleep in adobe houses that collapsed instantly. Guatemala's mountainous terrain triggered thousands of landslides that buried entire villages and cut off remote communities for weeks. Guatemala's extreme poverty made the disaster particularly deadly. Most buildings lacked earthquake-resistant construction, medical facilities were inadequate, and the government had limited resources for rescue operations. 2. December 16, 1920. Gansu earthquake, 200,000 deaths. The same day as the Haiyuan earthquake, a separate 8.6 magnitude quake struck Gansu province. The earthquake triggered massive landslides that buried entire counties under waves of liquefied earth. The region's unique geology made the disaster catastrophic. Loess, a fine wind-blown sediment covering much of northwestern China, behaves like liquid when shaken by earthquakes. Entire villages vanished under flowing rivers of earth. The landslides dammed rivers, creating temporary lakes that later burst and caused devastating floods. Some areas were buried under 100 feet of debris, with no trace remaining of the communities beneath. The earthquake struck during warlord conflicts, and government response was minimal. Many survivors received no aid for months, leading to additional deaths from exposure and starvation. 1. 1931. China floods. 3.7 million deaths. The deadliest natural disaster of the modern era struck China in the summer of 1931. The Yangtze, Yellow, and Huai rivers flooded simultaneously, creating an inland sea covering 70,000 square miles and affecting over 50 million people. The disaster began with extreme weather. Heavy winter snow, followed by intense spring rains and relentless summer monsoons. By July, all three major river systems were overflowing their banks at once, something that had never been recorded before. Nanjing, China's capital, disappeared underwater for months. The city's ancient walls became islands in a vast lake. Refugees crowded onto railway embankments, rooftops, and hilltops, any high ground they could find. Disease spread rapidly through the overcrowded refugee camps. Cholera, typhoid, and dysentery killed as many people as the initial flooding. Bodies floated downstream for weeks, contaminating water supplies and creating a cycle of death that continued long after the waters receded. The agricultural impact was catastrophic. The flood zone included China's most productive farmland. Crops were destroyed across multiple provinces, creating famine that lasted for years. The economic devastation weakened China just as Japanese military pressure was intensifying. These disasters from the past century teach us that nature's power remains absolute, but human preparation can dramatically reduce death tolls. The difference between the 1970 Ebola cyclone that killed 500,000 and modern cyclones in Bangladesh that kill hundreds instead of hundreds of thousands lies in early warning systems, storm shelters, and evacuation procedures. The people who died in these 15 disasters cannot speak, but their stories echo through time with one clear message. Nature will always test humanity's limits, but preparation, cooperation, and respect for natural forces can mean the difference between tragedy and survival.